listening. They're growing every second here. We had over 400 people register, so we'll see how many show up ultimately.
Wow.
But I want to let people know, my name's Chuck Marohn. I've got Jeff Speck here with me. We're going to talk about cities. We're going to talk about walkability. I'm going to ask you some questions about autonomous vehicles. We're going to spend the first little bit of time here. I've got some questions for you I want to ask to kind of set the stage. But we pitched this whole thing as a way for people to ask you questions. So I'll let participants know. In the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A button. If you go to that and you want to enter a question for Jeff, put your question in there. Here in about 15 minutes, I will get to those, and I will do my best to ask Jeff the question and interpret it and follow up on it and hold him accountable so he answers all your really tough questions. Jeff likes brutally difficult questions, so don't hold back, make them tough. Jeff, welcome to Strong Towns Webcast. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Chuck. And of course, we go back a long way, but I've enjoyed your meteoric rise with great pleasure over the years.
Well, whatever success that I have experienced or will experience, I owe quite a debt to you and some others who have inspired me greatly. I've told you before, and I'll say it again, Suburban Nation, it came to me at exactly the right time in my life when I was searching for answers, and it filled in so many blanks I had and really intellectually put me in a different frame of mind. So I owe a debt to you and Andres and so many other people. So thank you.
Well, I don't know. We've had this conversation, but since our last conversation was lost and destroyed anyway,
it's somewhere. We're searching for it.
Okay. But the experience, about once a conference, someone will come up to me and say, "Hey, thank you. It's because of Suburban Nation that I'm a city planner," or whatever. And first I apologize.
Yeah.
But then I tell them the story. The experience you had, Chuck, when you first read it was the experience I had in 1987 or 8 when I first heard Andres Duani give that towns versus sprawl talk.
Yeah.
And hearing that talk just kind of dropped the scales from my eyes. And it was, first of all, it was like the best story I'd ever heard. Like, it made so much sense that,
right.
It explained things that I had always kind of understood viscerally, but never intellectually. And then I said, "Oh my God, this has to be a book." And it took like another decade, but we made a book out of it.
Right.
It literally took more than a decade from that moment. But your gratitude to me is matched by my gratitude to Andres and Liz, who really turned me on to the same subject matter.
Well, we're all in we're all standing on each other's shoulders in a way. So I feel very humbled by it all. Let me ask you, you published Walkable City, what, 5 years ago?
Actually, almost, I guess it'd be 5.5 years ago.
Okay. This was a book that I think, well, let me put it this way. I think it was overdue. I think people were hungry for it. I also think that it marked kind of a sea change in the way people started to talk about walkability. I want to give you an opportunity to talk about kind of the aftermath of that book. What have you seen change in our dialogue, in the way we talk about walkability, and what have you seen change on the ground post publishing of that book?
I mean, I'd be curious for you what you meant by what you just said, but for me, it was more of a sea change in how we talk about design. So
okay, I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that aspect of it. Yeah,
because there's a lot of, if I can say, there's a lot of great stuff in Walkable City that is important to read on its own, but probably the key accomplishment of that book was to reframe the whole argument in terms that the average person could really connect with.
Right.
So, we used to call what we did neo-traditional town planning, and then we called it new urbanism, and we've always had plenty of kind of urban design or planning explanations for the work that we're doing that may or may not have gone over the heads of different people or just failed to interest them in the work we were doing. But by reframing it within the rubric of walkability, suddenly it was accessible, it was relatable, and it was easy to communicate. And I think, I look back, I'm really grateful I chose that title and that orientation. But probably the key intellectual leap, which, was not mine alone, was to understand that it was all frameable in terms of the walkable city, and that everything that we want to do in terms of better city planning, better regional planning, better urban design, and better architecture could actually be explained in those terms.
Yeah. I feel like, in a way, and I'll say this as like a physics geek, someone who has always loved like the deep physics, there's something refreshing about Stephen Hawking and the fact that he can take quantum physics and make it readable. I have myself been able to give your book to many, many laymen, many people who have no urban planning experience, no, deep background in design. They've taken it and said, this is profound, and it's really mattered to them. I'm assuming that was your intent.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to hear that. The goal for me has always been, and it even happened with Suburban Nation, which, obviously if you heard Andres or Liz talk about those same issues, it was immediately accessible and relatable. But it's always been, the unstated and kind of the unconscious goal of my career to popularize and promulgate these issues beyond the elite conversation of people who are trained in design. My undergraduate thesis in architecture, well, it was art history, but in architecture, was about the distinction between popular taste and professional taste in architecture. And I've always been fascinated by this wall that seems to exist between the professionals and the general public. And I've always been super interested, perhaps because I didn't really fit in as a young kid. I've always been super interested in reaching out and having a conversation with everybody, not just with a little clique.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I'd love to read that, actually. Tell us a few of the things that you see happening right now in cities. Some of the innovative stuff that you're witnessing, maybe that you're taking part in. I'd like to give people just kind of a broad overview of what you think is the cutting edge today in terms of walkability and building cities that are safe and accessible for people.
So it has been amazing if you look back, and I'm really a second generation new urbanist, but if you look back at how things were, in the late 80s, and I joined DPZ for a decade in 1993, compared to how they are now, and certainly compared to how they were even when the movement started, but particularly just in my own personal experience, the landscape that meets us, and I'm speaking, I guess, metaphorically more than physically, but the landscape that meets us when we arrive in cities to do the work that we do is completely changed. The intellectual landscape, the social approach, and I'm sure there are places in America which haven't advanced at all and are still completely backwards in these
right.
regarding these issues, where the car culture still completely dominates and the automotive hordes are not to be thwarted in any way. But most places where we go, we get just a completely different reception. We've been arguing we've gotten better, and our approach has reformed over the years in certain subtle and not so subtle ways, kind of most visibly as applies to, say, bicycles and bicycle use. But we've been trying to sell the same stuff, I should say build the same stuff for decades, many decades in my mentor's case. And when you show up in places to do it now, there is a general, probably something's already been done there,
Right.
Like there's probably an example that's hopefully pretty good that has already established a willingness for people to do more. And B, whether or not there's something there already, everyone, at least in the public discourse who comes out, not everyone, but there seems to be a majority of people participating in the public process who want this stuff that a few decades ago they weren't necessarily prepared to say that they wanted.
I
I
heard
was,
Andres once say you'd spend 80% of your budget just teaching people.
oh,
You know, you
absolutely.
gotta, yeah. And you're
Yeah.
saying
And
that that's changed.
teaching's a nice word for it. I mean, he used to say, uh, the fee for this project is 40 grand, but if there's a public process, it's 200. And of course, it wasn't, it wasn't that we were trying to avoid the public process, but it was an acknowledgement that the most expensive part of planning necessarily, it's unavoidable, but the most expensive part of planning is the public process and bringing people into the fold. But I was in DC last weekend and I was having drinks with a number of urbanists, and Jeff Anderson was there, who's the head of Smart Growth America.
Yep.
And he reminded me of how much we had accomplished in his delight at experiencing, with someone advocating for smart growth, which is considerably more sophisticated in some ways, it's at the regional scale rather than just talking about individual neighborhoods, that he feels, and I would agree, that the intellectual battles have been won. I used to say after Suburban Nation that we were kind of like, the creation of the built environment in America was kind of like this massive cruise ship that was headed for an iceberg, not yet melted. And the captain had given the command to turn the ship around, right? Because the leadership of the architectural, urban design, planning, real estate development, industries, and probably some others as well, all under, I should say, government leadership, transit oriented or transportation leadership, all understood that that neighborhood-based design, smart growth, new urbanism were the right solution, and that war had been won. But the ship still headed towards the iceberg, and I would say
Right.
the ship is still headed towards the iceberg. But now everyone on board, not just the captain, is starting to wish it wasn't and try to do things to change that. The other big realization I've had over the years, and I share this with Jeff, but I think he had the same impression, is that I used to hope that we could stop sprawl. Like, I think when I wrote those words on the page in Suburban Nation, many of which were Andres and Liz's, but when I wrote those words down, it was with the goal of slowing and stopping the sprawl engine and thinking it was possible.
Right. Right.
And then subsequently, when the Smart Growth Manual came out closer to 2010, that was written at a time when we were experiencing this huge breather. There was almost no construction. And the thought was perhaps, and I think we said that in the book, perhaps this hiatus was the opportunity we needed to recognize our error, move beyond the fact that it was just a banking error and realize that it was a whole form and mode and style of investment error, and come back to building properly and leave it all behind. But I think by that point, it was almost a rhetorical hope and less of a actual belief that was possible. But I have to say that I've reached the point now, this is going to sound really horrible, and probably in terms of climate change, it is horrible, that I don't feel like stopping sprawl is possible, period. My goal is no longer to stop sprawl. My goal, along with I think many of my colleagues, is to create more opportunities for people who wish to not have the auto-dependent lifestyle to be able to find that lifestyle near them and in an attainably priced way.
Yeah.
And so I think for most new urbanists now, the question isn't to sprawl or not to sprawl. It's how many places can we reform to be more walkable, and how many new places can we build, because the population is growing, where people can live in a more walkable way.
What is that shift from? I mean, because I have to tell you, I'm in that same camp. I think 10 years ago, I wanted to kill this stuff. Like I wanted it dead. And now I'm more of like, I mean, I was in North Dakota this week and I met with the governor and I said, you're not going to stop this, just try to diminish it and let it burn out, but really get something good going over here and you'll generate more demand for it. Are we just older and more pragmatic, or is this just, now the wind's more at our back, or what is the deal?
So I think the first thing to acknowledge in your that you're meeting with the governor makes me concerned about is we still must, well, we're not going to kill sprawl. We still have to do everything we can to eliminate all the hidden subsidies that support sprawl. When I was the National Endowment for the Arts, I helped create the Governor's Institute on Community Design, which still exists and which tries to teach that lesson to state leadership. But the fact is that sprawl's subsidies still are full bore, from all the oil and gas subsidies to highway subsidies to everything else that's still out there. One of the big reasons why we can't stop sprawl is not just habit, it's just the ongoing subsidization of that form of land settlement. So I think before we move on, that needs to be mentioned.
Right.
I think the biggest driver of the change, and I talk about this in Walkable City, and I learned most of it from Chris Leinberger, the economist, but I think the principal driver behind the refocus on more walkable places is demographics. And, we've gone from a country in which the majority of the households were kind of nuclear households with parents and children and one sort of lifestyle to a country in which I believe now only 22% of families are traditional families, or 22% of households are two parents with a child or children, while 66% of our housing stock is single family houses. So you have this tremendous disconnection between, it's a mismatch between supply and demand. And Chris Leinberger pointed out that, it's a few things. It's those demographics. It's also the fact that what has each generation what is their ideal image of quality of life been? And, how we were raised on, well, you're a little younger than me, but my generation was raised.
Not too much, man.
My generation was raised on suburban shows, like Happy Days and Partridge Family and Brady Bunch. And the current, millennial generation was raised on Friends and Sex and the City and How I Met Your Mother and all these urban shows. And the polling, this polling's a number of years old now, but the polling of millennials, 7 years ago was that 77% of them said they plan to live in America's urban cores. But what you have now is this, you have this demographic condition where you have the millennials and the baby boomers, and both of those are at a place in their lives now where they have no use. They don't have much use for the big single family house with the big yard and the, big interior to clean and, or the better schools, frankly, which drove a lot of people to the suburbs. And what they want is convenience. They don't want to be auto dependent because they might lose the ability to drive. And then of course the millennials, they aren't yet thinking about they're just now beginning to think about their situation with children. But their housing choices are principally based around a lifestyle image, which is very, very urban in ideal.
Right. I'm going to switch over to questions now.
Okay.
We have almost 250 people joining us here. If any of you would like to ask Jeff a question, it's your turn. There's 16 of them lined up here. I told you you might get some technical ones, Jeff. The first one is from Dan Bourbon. Dan wants to know what population density is required to support a walkable commercial center. Is there a magic number that we can spec, please?
Not Dan Burden.
No, not Dan Burden.
Not the famous Dan Burden.
No.
I don't think there's any one number that we would talk about. I think if you're creating a commercial center that has a corner store and a number of other things, these days you need to look at both the existing population around it and, frankly, in most of America, how many cars are driving by, right? I mean, the retail experts like Bob Gibbs are going to ask for the car count before they ask you for the population density. When you're designing a new neighborhood that's kind of standalone, you probably need about 1,000 households. This is shocking, but you probably need about 1,000 households just to support a corner store, which is why often that corner store can and should be subsidized, frankly, by the developer.
Right.
There's given that most people will walk 5 or 10 minutes max to that sort of thing, and that you want about 1,000 households, that would suggest a population density of perhaps 5 or 6 units per acre. You have to do the math, but I'm thinking about, a traditional neighborhood with a fair amount of open space, and of course, only half the property actually privately developed because the rest is streets and parks and other stuff. At a traditional suburban density of 5 units per acre, if you have some apartments, towards the center and larger houses towards the edge, that might be, I guess I can do the math. In my experience, that's been about 1,000 households or a little bit less.
Right.
That's enough for a corner store. The simple answer to the question is, the more density you have, the more retail you can have, and it's a sliding scale.
Right. It's funny because years ago I was up in this very small town in Minnesota, population about 850. And I was talking to some of the old timers, and they told me all the businesses that used to be in that town back in the 60s, right? Before people, would drive 40 miles to the grocery store, which is pretty common in this part of the world. And I was astounded because they had a full city there with everything that you would need, including grocery and hardware store and shoe repair and clothes and all this. So yeah, I think we've not adjusted our minds to what's possible in some ways.
Well, but those numbers and the current numbers are in the context of whether there was alternatives.
Right. Exactly.
So,
exactly.
It
was a captured market. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the local downtowns have been replaced in many cases by regional downtowns, which have been replaced by big boxes, which have been replaced by Amazon. And so, most of the clients I work with these days who want to have a vital downtown from scratch are actually starting by building a category killer town center that will be so attractive and incredible that it'll put the last retail model out of business. And then, of course, what makes it urban is that it's not just that. It also has a ton of apartments, a ton of office. And essentially what you're doing is you're creating a city again.
From scratch, right. Joe Sullivan wants to know, do you think bus rapid transit can be a viable transit option instead of light rail? And he cites specifically Tampa Bay, which does not have a transit system at all.
Yeah.
What's your opinion?
The answer is yes. And there's plenty of examples around the world to study that. The best being like in South America and Curitiba, Brazil, and other places like that, where they're very effective bus rapid transit systems. The main thing I learned, I learned so much from Jarrett Walker, Human Transit.
Me too.
And
yeah.
One of the things he reminded me that I learned recently is that the best approach to transit design is to be completely, completely Catholic, or to have no particular focus on technology.
Sure.
That what matters is how many people you're moving, with what frequency, and how quick the transfers are through, and how they're able to get to different places in your urban network. And if you get that right, it really doesn't matter whether there's a rail under the vehicle or it's a bus. Okay. The issue with BRT, I would say, is theoretically it's completely viable as an alternative to trains. Practically speaking, in the U.S., many municipalities or counties, et cetera, are reluctant to give it the dedicated road space that allows it to function properly. So I always ask, is there really an R in your BRT? Because
right. Is it just BT? Yeah.
The things that make it rapid are the hardest things to get. And there are a number of BRT systems that are really just BT because they haven't gotten the dedicated roadway, and they're fighting cars for road space, and they're stuck in the same traffic the cars are in. So there's really no benefit to taking it.
Spencer wants to know, what successes can you share regarding successful implementation of safe bike ped crossings in the high density neighborhoods where a vast majority, and he capitalizes vast, majority of residents aren't politically involved. So how do you make change in doing some of these technical things when, people are not involved in the process as it's set up?
Well, I mean, I think what he's suggesting is he's doing one of two things. He's either picking on his current process in his community, where they've done a really bad job of involving people, or he's dealing with the common circumstance where the community and the planners make a real effort to involve people, but no one shows up.
Right.
And
right.
I would say in either case, how many people really are involved doesn't matter if you get the right outcome. And the right outcome, of course, is improved facilities. But it's like a 4-part question, and one part is how important.
I only read you one paragraph of 6,
okay.
So
But,
there's a lot to his question.
The real question is how important is public involvement? But I would turn to the other part of the question, which is name some success stories. And I was blown away today because but I'm working on a new book, which I'll talk to you about. I've pretty much finished it. And every now and then you read a news article, you're like, oh, I have to change my book because this is so important. It has to go in there. And I was reminded, the New York Times recently wrote an article about Queens Boulevard in Queens, New York, that from 1990 to 2014 lost 186 humans. 186 people were killed. That's 1 every 7 weeks on this street over a quarter century. And they finally, by the way, 138 of those were pedestrians.
Yeah.
And they finally invested $4 million, which, by the way, values each human life at about 20 grand.
Right.
They invested $4 million in 2014 in better crosswalks. They put in bike facilities and other stuff, and they haven't had a death since. And, I don't know what the public process was. I honestly don't care. What matters is, and this is an issue in many of the cities I go to. Like, I don't need someone to tell me. Public process is fantastic and necessary for finding what you need to fix. But in terms of how to fix an intersection, I don't need someone to tell me how to stripe that. There's a technical solution for doing that properly and signalizing it properly. And with or without a public process, if you do that right, you will save lives. And it's amazing the degree to which we're not doing that in so many communities when a very limited investment would save many lives.
Jared Feringer, he wants to know about converting one-ways to two-ways. How do we convince municipalities to do that?
Wow. Okay. So the one thing I'm accused of doing that's rubber stamp when I go from city to city, the one thing that people say, you just do this everywhere, because I do it almost everywhere, is the conversion of multi-lane one-way systems that were once two-way back to two-way. And we call it reversion. We don't call it conversion because we want to remind people that they used to be two-way. So let me take a little break to tell you that my book, which I just completed, that unfortunately isn't coming out until the fall, is called Walkable City Rules. It's 101 steps to making better places. And each step is like 2 pages with a rule and then maybe a picture and a caption and then an explanation of what you need to do. And I think 4 of those rules are about convincing people and then successfully converting one-way systems back to two-way. The way that you convince them is by showing them in community after community how it's had a positive impact. And there's no longer any dispute. There had been for some while before much data was collected, but there's very clear data now that some of it, actually a bunch of it's in my book, Walkable City, which of course is already available. There'll be a lot more in this next book. But there's every piece of evidence to suggest that collisions drop, injury crashes drop precipitously, crime drops, businesses do better, real estate becomes more valuable when you revert these streets, for the simple reason that that they're currently functioning a bit like highways. When you have multiple lanes going in the same direction, it looks and feels like a half of a highway. And,
Exactly.
and, as Andres once said, streets generate real estate value and highways sunder real estate value. And the more a street looks like a highway, the more you're going to sunder that community.
Mhm.
There's plenty of data about all the stores that closed when the one-ways came in. There's a growing amount of data about stores that open when the two-ways come in. But probably the most significant conversation to have is about life safety and those distinctions. So there's a bunch of data in Walkable City. There's more in my upcoming book, but the best thing is to do is to cite positive examples.
I think it's hard on that one, Jeff. Is there a way to hack that? Like, yeah, I think of like Mike Lydon's stuff where he's out, putting in temporary crosswalks and using straw bales to show what it would look like. I've thought like we've got to be able to do that on some of these conversions. Have you ever seen that done?
I would think tactical urbanizing, a la Mike Lydon, a one-way to two-way would be very technically complex.
It would. That's what I was thinking too.
Yeah, but I could imagine. Let's say you've got a two-way. You've got a pair of one-ways, and you pretend that one of them has to be closed for a street repair, and so you route traffic on the other one with a lot of cones and probably people directing the traffic. But no, I don't think there's an easy hack for that. I do know that even communities that were very reluctant to do it, like Davenport, Iowa, where we recommended it a long time ago, they've slowly started doing it street by street and having only positive outcomes. The place I would point people to right now, I guess I'd point them two places. I'd point them to Oklahoma City, where we did a project where, they had an entirely, their downtown core, 40 blocks, was half one way. And we converted it all to two-way, and they had a lot of money, so they rebuilt the whole thing with oil and gas money,
Right.
and it's functioned wonderfully. It's best understood in the context of what it was like before, though, because if you go to Oklahoma City from, say, Savannah, it will not look very walkable, but you have to know what it was like before.
Right.
But I just did a plan with Nelson Nygaard about 3 years ago for New Albany, Indiana, which is a city right by Louisville. And we literally, to their credit, they converted about 3 miles of streets in their downtown core from one-way to two-way, reverted, in a summer.
Yeah.
And another 2 miles they gave road diets to. And it's, the world didn't come to an end. There has not been a traffic nightmare. And everyone tells you it just feels a lot safer. So there's some really good recent examples to point to.
I've got a question here from George Schricker. He wants to know about the buttons you have to press to get a walk sign. He says, why do we have to push these buttons? It drives me crazy. Why? I think I understand why they came about, but why do they persist today? Why is this an acceptable thing?
First of all, I think 85% of them do nothing. That's technically, studies have been done.
Right.
That doesn't mean that it was introduced cynically. Most of them once did something, but I think about 85% of them now do nothing. And there's actually a point in my upcoming book that's a whole section dedicated to these push buttons and has all this data, which I don't have in front of me. There are those occasional ones that work. I'm sitting next to my window here. Out my window is, in the middle of Beacon Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, is the Green Line T, the train. It's the streetcar. Someone in their wisdom realized that people sprint across this pretty wide street to get to the train when they see it. And they put a push button in front of my house that the minute you hit it, the light turns yellow.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. Red. The light turns yellow the minute you hit it. So within 2 seconds, it's a red light, and you can cross instantaneously. That's a push button that works and should be used. The majority of push buttons exist in places where the traffic engineers who think only about cars and not about other forms of transportation like walking have been allowed to dominate the environment. And I like to say, a pedestrian should never have to ask for the light. or for a light.
Right.
There are unusual places where it's a state highway and no one ever walks except for a few pedestrians occasionally. And there it makes sense in terms of traffic control, given how few pedestrians there are, to request, to put in the push button for the request. But if an intersection is regularly visited by humans on foot, there's really no point in it. And the trend in those cities that understand it is to eliminate those lights. And I would say more and more cities that I go to, they say, oh yeah, we're getting rid of them. Or what they do is they just turn them off, but they're still there and people are still pushing them, which is
press them. Yeah.
Obviously there's another step. We need like a universal cap that sits on top of the push button that says, this isn't working, because in fact, most places where you see the push buttons have a more proper solution, which is the standard, what we call concurrent signalization, right? Concurrent signalization, where if you're crossing this way, you get the walk signal. When the car is going this way, you get the drive signal. Now, the latest version, of course, is called the LPI, the lead pedestrian indicator, where you get the walk signal 3 to 5 seconds, usually about 3 seconds. DC's full of them. New York's introducing a bunch, where you get the walk before the cars get the green. And that way you advance and you're able to claim the crosswalk before the cars start to try to turn through it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But there are still cities, and this is how it was in New Albany, Indiana, where actually that you would never get the walk sign without pushing the button. And that's simply, I'm not telling you it's easy to overcome, but it's a conversation, a simple conversation to have at the city level to say, is this the signal that we want to be sending to all pedestrians, that they're second-class citizens, and in fact, their environment doesn't belong to them?
It seems like a technical change that we can make without spending a lot of money that would have a huge impact in a lot of places.
Well, it's the sort of thing that was introduced with zero public process, and you'd like to be able to remove it with zero public process.
Right. True.
Right.
Okay. David Thurlow wants to know about, his question's really about ride hailing services. So let me see. Do you see the growth of ride purchasing as helpful or as harmful? And he's really talking about, helpful in terms of reducing private vehicle ownership, or harmful to mass transit, active transportation. So let's not focus on AVs at this point. Let's just focus on like Uber and Lyft and ride hailing.
So I was asked to speak at Uber.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
And I did.
Okay.
But before I did, I said, I'll be friendly, but you're not going to like it. Like, right. It's not going to be good news. And then I did before.
And they were cool with that. They were good with that. They still invited you.
I have to say, the people at Uber who I met were fantastic people, and they were very welcoming, and they weren't just fantastic people. They were, they were kind of the bright and bushy-tailed younger people who want to make a positive difference in the world. And I may have ruined their day, but the issue with ride hailing is that if you look into it, as I did further in preparation for this talk, you keep finding bad thing after bad thing.
Right.
70% or I think it's 2/3 of the moving violations in San Francisco surrounding it was a certain type of moving violation. Basically, nuisance moving violations in San Francisco, 70% of them are committed by ride hailing.
No kidding, really?
But that's kind of like the anecdotal stuff. Here's the technical stuff. And I talked to this guy named Alejandro Henao. And Alejandro Henao has this amazing PhD paper that I discovered on Streets Blog, where he was earning his PhD in transportation analysis while serving intentionally as an Uber and Lyft driver for a year. And everyone he rode around, he gave a questionnaire to, and most of them filled it out. And based on their responses to the questionnaires and to his own experience as a driver, here's some of the data. And I'm gonna get it a little bit wrong because I don't have it in front of me. First of all, fully 1/3 of the trips were people who would have otherwise walked, biked, or taken transit. So you're actually removing people from more healthy ways of getting around and contributing to traffic in the road. Not anecdotally, but as an aside to that, the experience in those cities which are studying it like New York and more recently Boston, is very clear that ride-hailing services are undermining transit ridership and putting more people on the street. Secondarily, for every 100 miles that he drove, he had to drive 160 miles.
Right.
So he's someone who deadheaded immediately and instantly. He didn't cruise around looking for opportunity. He made it, you know, to be as conservative as possible. Whenever he finished a ride, he would pull over and wait. And he found that it was 160 miles for every 160 passenger miles. Contrast that to the claims now being minutely substantiated that people are going to start getting rid of their cars. My question is, are people going to get rid of 60% of their cars? Or that's not the number. Is there going to be a commensurate reduction in car ownership to make up for the 60% of additional driving that's happening because of all the scooting around, getting from passenger to passenger? Also, why is it better having fewer cars? Let's think about this. What really matters in terms of pollution in the construction of the car and in the use of the car is simply how many miles are cars driving. The principal contribution to climate change, pollution, everything else that you care about with cars, or even congestion, it's not how many people own cars, it's how many miles cars are being driven. Switching from a personal family car to a Lyft car doesn't mean all of a sudden the car can go twice as far before you have to replace it with another car, right? In fact, people's desires for newer cars probably mean there's more cars being manufactured. So the slight reduction in auto ownership, to my understanding, doesn't begin. It would have to be incredibly huge, remarkable, a whole societal shift in car ownership for it to make up for the fact that there's all these other cars on the road. All these additional miles being driven in between trips. Additionally, he noted to me in a phone conversation that in South America and other cities, tons of people who couldn't otherwise own cars are using being a Lyft or Uber driver as a way to get a car.
A way to pay for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you have is a tremendous uptick in car purchases of people who would not otherwise have one, but they want to have a car, so they become a Lyft or Uber driver, get the car, and then they drive themselves and others all over the place. So these issues and others all add up to, nothing really good, I think, coming, or I should say a net negative coming out of car share. And we all feel so virtuous when we use it. And I'm just trying to get over that because it's not.
Well, you wrote a really great piece, the 10 rules about automated vehicles. And I want you to talk about one specific part of that being the induced demand aspect. And also maybe tie it into the geometry. There's a sense that if we go to automated vehicles, it's going to reduce congestion. It's going to allow people to get places more quickly. It's going to cut greenhouse gases. I tend to be the curmudgeon on this, and I hear you being the curmudgeon a little bit.
Sorry, I'm taking some of your curmudgeon work. I would direct our 249 participants to my website, which is jeffspeck.com. And on that website, there's a couple of videos, one of which, it's at the bottom, it shows people in an autonomous vehicle. And it's my talk about autonomous vehicles. But there's also, I guess that's the main resource I would send them to. You can also find it just by Googling Jeff Speck CNU lecture. And there's actually a better version. This is why I was thinking, there's a better version of that talk that I gave at the CNU, Congress for New Urbanism, Jeff Speck CNU lecture, autonomous, and you'll find it. So like everything else, Chuck, when I was presented with an opportunity to talk about autonomous vehicles, which is funny because I was given a plenary at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which is such an incredible opportunity. And I got the phone call like 3 weeks before the plenary it was the typical phone call where I knew it was going to fall through. And it was Mayor Cornett, who's the president of the Conference of Mayors, who said to me, Jeff, you still get to do the plenary. I'm like, okay. And he said, oh, all the mayors want to hear about, I thought I was going to get to give one of my great talks about why walkability is so important and how to achieve it in your city. And he said, the mayors just want to hear about autonomous vehicles. I'm like, oh, damn. So I did what I usually do when presented with a new subject I need to be an expert on, which is I spoke to the people who know the most about it. And particularly, I talked to Jarrett Walker of Human Transit, and I talked to Paul Moore, who's one of the really smart folks at Nelson Nygaard Transportation Planning. And their feelings kind of dovetail with my feelings and what technical data we have about how these things are expected to function. The first thing, just because it's popping into my mind first, I will remind people of Jarrett Walker's conversation that you asked about regarding geometry.
Right.
And Jarrett always says, you can't beat I forget his term that's more catchy than this, but you just can't beat geometry. The fact that that an L train in New York City carries 2,000 people, one L train, and even if you're carpooling, you're not coming close with folks in cars.
500 cars. Yeah, if you pack 4 in each of them. Yeah.
and think about the amount of space that it takes. And the fact is that in cities which have no and anticipate no traffic congestion, in which space within streets is not contested, it does seem reasonable to me that autonomous vehicles could replace transit, right? Because transit isn't serving much of a function in those, is not economically working in those places anyway. If you're in a city that has, if you're in Waterloo, Iowa, maybe, you could imagine replacing your transit system with AVs. But anywhere denser than that, even Iowa City, you're going to have a real congestion problem if you take those people out of the buses they're in and put them into autonomous vehicles, even if they're multi-person and even if they're swarming. So if you just do the math on the geometry, that's the issue. But the biggest issue is, as it always is with traffic, the concept of induced demand. And what the autonomous vehicles promise to do is to dramatically reduce the cost of driving in 2 important ways, right? 1, the cost, and 2, the time cost, which is huge. When you think about the difference between being stuck behind the wheel and being able to actually sit in a lovely environment with a desk or an opportunity to watch cat videos, whatever, and get other stuff done. And because the principal constraint to drive, this is what the whole induced demand discussion is, that because the principal constraint to driving is congestion, anything you can do, it's not congestion, it's time wasted in traffic born of congestion, right?
Right.
So because time wasted in traffic is the principal thing that stops people from driving, anyone who's thought about it realizes that when you reduce the cost, not just in money, but in time of driving, you're going to have so many more vehicles on the road that'll make up for the swarming, make up for all the other things that are imagined. And of course, it'll be an inducement to sprawl as well, because there's now an even more affordable way to get to a little dacha out in the countryside, somewhere. But I'm reminded of a charrette that we did in Jakarta when I was at DPZ, and our hotel was about a block from our studio, and they took us there in helicopter. And the reason they took us there in a helicopter is because it would have literally taken an hour each way to go that 1 block on the street. Because why? The street was full of 2 different types of people. It was full of poor people whose time was not valued highly, who actually could lose a couple hours and it wouldn't impact their bottom line. And it was full of rich people in limousines who A, can sit and get work done, and B, have the status of sitting in their limousine, which is a whole other thing that's, driven car culture in this country and around the world. So the prediction among those who study it is that the reduced cost and the reduced time cost will cause a ton of induced demand. And then the question, which I think, I've already slightly answered today, in my opinion, and what I've learned from others, is that the increase in demand will far outweigh the increase in efficiency that these cars provide. But one of the biggest questions I have is, in America, our cities haven't even shown the capacity to introduce something as simple and smart as congestion pricing. Not even New York managed to introduce congestion pricing. In Europe, you have zona blues and pedestrian-only zones, and the stuff they're doing in Barcelona with these super blocks where there's very little driving within the block. And there's been a kind of a top-down, more social democratic approach where people tell people what to do with their cars. That never happens in America. We never tell anyone what to do with their cars. So what's going to happen is, as soon as these cars are available, and I think it's going to be a while, but as soon as these cars are available, the richer Americans are going to buy them, and they're going to use them the way they want to use them. No one's going to tell them that they have to swarm. No one's going to make sure that the dude with the Camaro can't drive in the middle of the city, because he always has and he always will. And so a lot of the efficiencies that come from a top-down organized approach, which might be possible in a different sort of country, I don't think they'll be available to us here.
Right. Daniel Matthews wants to know about parking, and he kind of argues that, like, hey, the battle the new urbanists is waging have not been won. We're still requiring parking all over the place. And it's funny because I was in New York last year walking around with Ian Rasmussen, one of our mutual friends, Ian, who does legal work in New York. And he was pointing out to me all the parking that was required in Manhattan. I mean, it is in like the middle of the densest spot in the country because of minimum parking requirements. So here's Daniel's question. What is the best practical argument to persuade planning and zoning boards to accept variances which reduce parking requirements? And I guess I'll take that a step further. Is that a waste of time to try to get variances? I mean, how should we be approaching minimum parking standards? What's the Zen point we push on to get changes there?
I think the practical conversation to have is to understand that developers know what they can sell and they know what they can finance. I think the real challenge technically is convincing the developers, frankly, to reduce their parking requirements. But the conversation to have with cities is that if a developer shows up and has confidence that they do not have any need to build parking, or they want to build less parking, they're investing a lot of money and other people's money that they're on the line for, based upon a confidence, a very well studied confidence about their market. The other thing, of course, is to understand that the market has all different segments in it, and particularly in larger cities, even if most people in that city are driving, there's a segment probably unserved by real estate developers that doesn't want to drive, and that they'll be drawn to these projects. It's an interesting thought experiment, but if you build two buildings in the same city and one provides couple parking spaces per unit and the other provides 0 parking spaces per unit, what's going to happen at these two buildings? And what's funny is it's usually the neighbors who are fighting for the new developments to have a lot of parking in them, right?
Right.
That's usually what happens. It's the neighbors who say, you can't let that developer have no parking because his tenants are going to burden my streets. Well, what happens in that thought experiment is that when you build the apartment house with parking, everyone comes, people who own cars choose to live in that apartment house. And then they're probably trying to park on street because they don't want to have to get it in and out of the basement all the time. At least during the day, they're parking it on street, and they're fighting you for your street space. And they're adding congestion to your streets. If you build no parking, the people who choose to live in that building are going to be the people who already don't have cars. They're going to self-select to be in a place where they're not paying for cars, and they won't be competing with you for parking or for driving, right?
Right.
But what that all gets to is that the biggest challenge is the neighbors. And that's where I have something that I call a parking preservation plan. I don't do it because I'm bored by that kind of work, but I've always believed that the right way to get this stuff done in neighborhoods before you do a planning plan, for any new development, is to start by doing a parking preservation plan and take advantage of all these tools that, for example, we used in Washington, D.C. there's parking permit programs where, you can buy a permit for X amount of dollars and we're not going to give any more out. And the developer agrees that his or her tenants can't have parking permits. You can even write it into leases. Say, if you lease here, you may not own a car, and that's a function of your lease. But the biggest practical hurdle then is doing something to ensure the neighbors that they're on street parking, which they've gotten so used to they can't live without in their minds. But I've been there. I know that feeling, and it's very real that won't be threatened.
We've got 51 questions left and 3 minutes. So I'm going to go rapid fire. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm happy to go over a little bit.
Well, I can't go over. I'm in the recording studio,
Okay.
and we're supposed to start here at like 5 after. You're generous, and I really appreciate that. I want to ask, we've mentioned New York, DC. A lot of your work has been in smaller places. I mean, we talked about Oklahoma City, but I know you were in Driggs, Idaho, which is a place I've been as well. Now we're small town. Now we're small town America. So a last question here, and then I want to ask you about your book and a couple other housekeeping things. Beth Garrett, one of our members, is asking about small towns, and she's got a longer question here. I'm going to try to summarize it. She says, in small towns, a lot of stuff is just set up to perpetuate the worst kind of development. We've got the zoning codes, we've got the planning, or we got, the staff planner is someone who maybe has not been to the new urbanist, Congress and ingested all this stuff. When you go into a small town, where do you start? How do you get started? And I'm going to throw this in, Jeff, as like a personal thing. For me, I feel like small towns, we talk about the ship going towards the iceberg and how hard it is to change it. In a small town, you can have a big effect. You can change things really quickly.
Yeah.
But it almost seems like sometimes it's harder to change things in a small town, because everybody knows everybody, and it's just there's
That's
more.
That's why you still need someone from outside, right?
Well, talk about this. How do you change things in a small town environment?
Well, I do a ton of work in small towns. And, in fact, I'd say my practice is more focused on those places that aren't entirely up on best practices. They're never going to hire me in New York City or, frankly, probably in DC. But most of my work is in cities that really want to catch up, and some of those are quite small. The real challenge, if you're talking about walkability and the quality of life that walkability will give you, the real challenge is finding the limited part of town where that's possible. And if the community was developed principally after 1930 and doesn't really have anything but autocentric development, then there's almost no chance of that. Unless, they tried to hire me in Snowmass, and I said, I don't know how I can help you, do you? And they never wrote back. But the challenge is like a place like Tigard, Oregon, which is a suburb of Portland. You go there and you're like, what do you do here? And then you realize there's an old Main Street that they forgot about that's sitting there, and it's half empty but half not. And frankly, by just focusing on those 3 blocks and putting everything you got, into making something that's as perfect as you can, and then expanding outward from there, that's always been my focus. But just to give one example, I was invited to speak and give a little memo. Just a memo. They didn't have the capacity to pay for a big plan, and I understand. In a town called Newaygo, Michigan, about 3 months ago. And I went there and found that their Main Street, which happens to be a state highway, their Main Street was suffering. You could only park on one side of the street. And it was these wide lanes, and trucks are barreling through, logging trucks and everything else. And one sidewalk is completely unprotected from these logging trucks because you could only park on one side of the street. But the street had room for parking on both sides. Just the state highway had made the lanes too wide.
Yeah.
And I explained this to them, and I gave them all the data about 10 and 11 foot lanes versus 12 and 13, 14 foot lanes. And they called them the DOT, and we met. And within 6 months, that will be fixed. Wow. And they'll have a two-sided parking Main Street. And that's about one of 5 things that we figured out. All, mostly to do with just right sizing the lanes and right-sizing the parking. If there's too much room, turn the parking to an angle just so the driving lanes aren't so fast, adding bicycle facilities. And these are easy things that you can do just with paint. You don't even need to rebuild. And so, I always start with the main street, but then the street, not just the main street, but what's the configuration of the street? And even if it's a state that's in charge of the road, that, if it's got 14-foot lanes, they'll accept 11-foot lanes. You want 10, you won't get 10, but you'll get 11. So there's always little things to do like that.
You're going to be in Savannah for the CNU.
Correct.
Coming up here. People can find out about that at cnu.org. Jeff will be there. I'll be there. Going to be a ton of people. Are you doing any presentations there that you know of yet?
Yes. I forget exactly what.
Okay.
But I know that one thing I'm doing is introducing my friend, the folk singer Dara Williams, who I convinced to come.
Okay. There you go.
So I convinced her to come to CNU. She has a book, What I Learned in 1,000 Towns. She's become a bit of a city planner as a hobby. So I get to introduce her to the audience, a lot of whom will already know and love her. And then, I'm giving some other plenary, but I forget what it is.
Well, I'll make sure and be there when you do. And I might have to interview her. That sounds like a fascinating book too.
Your audience may not be that interested in this, Chuck, but my main goal for CNU is to be one of the judges in your trivia contest.
In the debates? You want to be a debate judge? Well, who do we nix then? Do we get rid of Andres?
I just want to sit in and see how it goes. I'm not sure if my sense of humor is quick enough, but I want to give it a try.
That is becoming a can't miss event, isn't it?
I always enjoy it. Yeah.
You have a book coming out then. Does it have a title yet?
Yeah. So my book, which is coming out in the fall, so it's a little early to plug it. But it's very much on my mind because I just finished the manuscript. It's with Island Press. It's going to be their lead book of the fall of all their titles. It's called Walkable City Rules, 101 Steps to Making Better Places. And the elevator pitch basically is that, Walkable City was great for getting people excited and inspired to make changes, but this is really the toolkit you need to do it. So it weaponizes Walkable City.
Are we gonna be able to do an interview then that doesn't get zapped into the ether this fall when that comes out? Is that part of the tour there?
If you'll accept me, I would love to do that.
I would love it. Let's plan on it.
Okay.
People can find you at jeffspeck.com. Is that the website?
Yes.
Okay. My friend, I'm honored that you would take the time and do this with us. We had a couple hundred people on here being able to enjoy. We're going to share it also, so thousands of other people will get to hear your wisdom. I always enjoy talking to you and learn something. And I just say, we got to play pool again. That was one of the funnest nights I ever had.
We'll find the spot in
on the
Savannah.
road. Let's do it.
All right.
All right.
Thanks so much for asking, and it's always a pleasure, Chuck.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all you do.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.